I want to welcome you all to this talk. This is a subject that has been important to many scholars for maybe now closer to a century than a couple of decades. And very hard to research, very hard to find information on. And Francis Galán has done this. I met Francis at a cemetery about 3 or 4 years ago, which is another story. And he was, getting out and meeting people, which is what we were doing, and was a recognition of actually Hispanic brothers who fought on the Republican side of the Alamo and then became subsequently Texas Rangers. Francis Galán is assistant professor of history at Texas A&M University San Antonio and teaches courses on Texas, Mexico, and Latin America. He previously taught at UTSA and Our Lady of the Lake University. He is a South Texas native, and Dr. Galán received his PhD in history from Southern Methodist University in Dallas, and his MA from UTSA, a BA from UT Austin, which a lot of us passed through there. Los Adayes, the first capital of Spanish Texas, was published in 2020 by Texas A&M University Press and is a finalist for the Ramirez Family Award from the Texas Institute of Letters for the most significant scholarly book. And I can tell you, this is not his favorite work of writing for me. I like the Chirino Boys, which is my favorite about smuggling at Los Adayes. And when that came out, there were a lot of colleagues, and actually colleagues of Catherine's, came and said, who are these guys? What is this? We've been looking for Los Adayes information for decades, and we can't find anything. So this resolves a lot. It's an important piece. When I found out he had published it, I sat in the meeting we were in and downloaded it to my Kindle and started on it, because it is worth the read and is a fabulous book. Welcome, Dr. Galán, to the Witte Museum. You get the mic.
Thank you very much, Bruce, for that wonderful introduction, and it's just an honor to always be here at the Witte. I mean, my favorite place, like everybody else talking about, growing up and just coming here, and fond memories with family and everything. And so I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to come here and talk a little bit about some aspects from my book on Los Adayes, the first capital of Spanish Texas. And as Bruce was just mentioning there about the Chirino Boys, I mean, I talk in there a little bit. A lot of the original settlers came from Saltillo, Coahuila, and there were a number of the soldiers that right before they set out with the Marqués de Aguayo in 1720 had gotten married actually in Monclova. So there's a deep history there in Coahuila and also Nuevo León in terms of the establishment of this, leading to this establishment. But it is interesting to note that I couldn't believe that nothing had been written about Los Adayes in the first place. And so I had gone to my mentor, David Weber, at SMU, and asked him if I could make this my topic. And he had said, is there enough research out there on it, number one, and number two, can you become passionate about it? Now, as far as passionate about it, I definitely become passionate about it because this is our Hispanic roots in Texas, and it's part of my background too. And so the other part about the records, I wasn't so sure. What I ended up discovering was that there is just so much archival records, and I just wondered, why didn't anybody write about it? And part of it could be the fact that this is located on the other side of the border, if you will. And let me see if I can get this to go. Here we go. And you can see that on the map right there, Los Adayes. And so it's not technically part of Texas history because physically the archaeological site is across the border, the state line between Texas and Louisiana. And in the early 1720s, you really only had three principal settlements. And you can see in the other circles, you have San Antonio and La Bahia. And then there was a Presidio, Texas, near present-day San Agustin, Texas, and that only lasted about 8 years. And Los Adayas was named capital in 1729 after the Marqués de Rivera did an inspection of the military during this time. And so with the records itself, it turns out that there's a ton of records in the Béjar archives. And this turned out to be perhaps to my benefit because when UT Austin was to translate a lot of these records of the Béjar archives because they were in possession of them, a lot of the late 18th century records began to be translated, but not the earlier records of the 18th century. So they were all in Spanish. And then there's some other records that include Los Adayas as well in the Nacogdoches archives as well as the Saltillo archives, and you have originals of those at UT Austin in the Dolph Briscoe Center for American History. But in this image here then, you can see lots of indigenous peoples. You see the Camino Reales, the principal one that came up through from Mexico City, but venturing eventually to the northeast, and it actually stopped at Los Adayas. It did not stop in French Natchitoches, which is another 15 miles to the east, although for practical matters, there was a lot of ties between Los Adayas and Natchitoches that the border is very fuzzy. And in the 1730s, the Spanish would end up trying to establish a border between Spanish Texas and French Louisiana, and I'll talk more about the reasons for that, and smuggling was a big part of that. But you also see in here what looks like Texas. It's not much. I mean, this is the dark shaded green area that is Spanish Texas. You have the provinces of Coahuila, Nuevo León, Nuevo Santander, that the area principally below the Nueces River is not part of Texas in the Spanish colonial period, but part of Nuevo Santander that would later become and established under Escandón in the mid-18th century, later on would become the Mexican state of Tamaulipas. But what's interesting is a lot of what happens in East Texas and northwestern Louisiana in terms of border issues gets replayed again after the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, and I would also argue after Texas independence from Mexico in 1836. And so this is like a whole other world that opens up to us in the colonial period. And you can see also the presence of the indigenous peoples, the Apaches, the Comanches behind them. You can see Coatecans, you can see the Carancoas, and essentially you have indigenous peoples in the southern plains that are establishing a border, preventing Spanish expansion to the north. You have the French in Louisiana that the Spanish are trying to check French westward expansion, and that pattern will repeat itself later with the British and then the Americans. And in East Texas, you have also the Queroan Indians. And for the most part, as we'll see here in just a little bit, you have a number of subgroups within the Hassanite Confederacy in particular. There were several confederacies, the Caddo Hadacho in the Four Corners region of Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas, and Oklahoma. You also had the Natchitoches Confederacy in northwestern Louisiana, after which the French established their post in 1714, and the Hassanite Confederacy in East Texas. And it's composed of about 9 or 10 different nations, including the Tejas, the Nacogdoches, and other groups. And so it's the Tejas in particular that is important to know about in terms of their relations with the Spanish. I mean, after all, we've got a conference from Tejas to Texas. And it's important to know some about the roots of that word, Tejas. And you see it in the documents. It literally says the Tejas Indians. And some scholars will point out that the Spanish would confuse them for the Hasinai and mix up the identity, if you will. But you see Tejas in the archives. They're referring to a specific group within that confederacy. And so then going across the border, I mean, when you come across this, you see the Toledo Bend Reservoir. Now, this is on the left-hand side of you looking back across the border towards Texas. But going across the Toledo Bend Reservoir, you know, you think that you're going to Port Aransas and you're going through Corpus Christi, you know, and you're going to the ocean. And it's hard to imagine that this is the interior portions of this Gulf coastal region. And it wasn't really until the 1950s that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers established this reservoir. And so it's not even the Sabine River that was the border. It's further east between the Spanish fort of Los Udayas and the French post of Natchitoches. And we'll see more here in a little bit. And on the right-hand side, you see the signs of that Camino Real. So it doesn't just stop in East Texas. It carries over into northwestern Louisiana. And that in itself is very significant, because when you think about Louisiana history and you think about what is Creole, what is Catholic, much of that is southern Louisiana, but you got this pocket in northwestern Louisiana that also is Creole, and the Spanish that contribute to that heritage in that corner of the state, because the northern portion of the state that is considerably Protestant, if you will. But you can see signage there, and when you go to the actual site, there's a really nice sign. This has become part of the U.S. National Parks, and so it's really nice to see it really getting more attention, because when I set out on this project, it was right before Hurricane Katrina, and the state of Louisiana was planning above-ground restoration of the fort, and Hurricane Katrina in 2005 just wiped out state budgets, and they never really got this off the ground. And so the archaeologist there, George Avery, had said, you know, we need a book about this place. And so that was this book. And there is a lot of research archaeologically that had been done out there. But in terms of the historical record, this is an example of a power of attorney document from 1738. And you get to see the names of the people who were there, the soldiers that were at the fort. And some of the main characters I've highlighted there. Lieutenant Joseph Gonzalez was in service at Los Udayas for the length of its existence, from the time that it was founded till the time that it was abandoned in 1773. And by the 1750s, you know, one of his own grandsons ended up serving with him at Los Udayas. And the next name, Mateo Ibarbo, most people may know of Antonio Gil Ibarbo, who's the founder of Natchitoches in 1779. Well, his father was Mateo, who had immigrated from Spain and ended up coming through San Antonio. And as a matter of fact, in 1728, the year before Antonio Gil Ibarbo was born at Los Udayas, his father had a daughter baptized in Mission San Antonio de Valero, and also had a adopted indigenous daughter. He became a godparent. And so there are already ties between San Antonio and Los Udayas from the very beginning. But the names just go on. And there is one of the Chirino boys there, Bruce. And it turns out that there were a bunch of Chirinos in Los Udayas, some good ones, and some not so good ones who were not didn't behave very well, as I mentioned in that piece on the Chirino boys. And then there were also Chirinos here in San Antonio. In talking to descendants, Los Bejareños, some years ago, there was a descendant who came up afterwards and suggested that the name Chirino may have also been changed later on to Quirino. And so that I did meet some people who were Quirinos, but in Saltillo, it's where the father came from Lázaro. He was part of the Ramon expedition in 1716 that had gone out in the Spain's second attempt to settle East Texas. The Chirino last name was in the documents Chirinos, and when I asked him if he recognized the last name Chirino, he goes, no hay Chirino aquí. But when I said, what about Chirinos? He goes, sí, hay bastante Chirinos aquí en Saltillo. So you got this issue with names. And that's just always been the case. And so perhaps I'll say more about names later, but one of the descendants that I talked to, Mary Lucille Rivers from Zwolle, Louisiana, nearby the Spanish fort, the site, her last name Rivers, it used to be Del Rio. At some point it was changed to Del Rio because that's the translation to rivers. And so they were descendants of Antonio del Rio and Manuel del Rio. And so you see Domingo, another one. And a lot of these names that get changed through the course of time. And another one that I actually didn't put here on the side, but that appears up here, is a Manuel Antonio Lozoya, because there's Lozoya and Esparza, and these are names that appear prominently later on during the Texas Revolution that I actually talk about more at the end of the book. But you have descendants from Los Arias who end up settling in San Antonio permanently at the former, become part of the Barrio de Valero. And so they have vested interest in the Texas Revolution later on. So the documentation, very important. But in this case, it would show that, they were supposed to get paid their wages. They'd have a power of attorney come from Mexico City to bring the plata, to bring the silver up. But a lot of times they wouldn't get paid. And then what happens a lot of times is, and this is an account book from 1739 that shows a lot of the kinds of goods that they would prefer. And you'd have soap, chocolate, sugar, clothing, sombreros. In one of the subsequent account books, there was even an entry for zapatos para mujeres. And I'm like, what? Well, why would there be like women's shoes on their account books? And it turns out that, you have spouses, you have daughters, and the French are nearby, and the French had the best tobacco. They had the best liquor. They had the best clothing. It was like the beginning of French fashions in the 18th century, I guess, and they were bringing some of that, into the interior here. But the point here, more importantly, is that when they didn't get paid their wages and they couldn't get access to goods, where are you going to get it? Indigenous peoples and the French. And it would also lead to issues of contraband trade and smuggling. And this is where it really becomes quite fascinating in terms of Spanish-Indian relations, because you hear about Comanches and Apache troubles in the 19th century Texas frontier, and it was there big time in the 18th century. The Spanish governor established a treaty with the Lipan Apaches in 1749. The Spanish eventually established a mission for them at San Saba in the Texas Hill Country in 1757. 1758, the Comanches come in and wipe it out. And then 1785, the Spanish governor in San Antonio, Cabello, ends up establishing a peace treaty with the Comanches. And one of the translators he had was a guy by the name of Pedro Gonzalez from Los Arias, who, after the fort was abandoned, was in San Antonio, and they liked him because they said that he could speak the Tejas language very well without an accent. And it kind of just goes to show that the people in East Texas were very much attuned to their environment, very much in tune to the indigenous peoples, and lots of trade. But a lot of times trade that wasn't necessarily legal, depending upon who you were asking. And in this case, what's cool about this document, and this is an investigation of Governor Barrios y Juaragui in 1761. He had been governor of Texas from 1751 to 1759, right when the French and Indian War began, and he started making a lot of lucrative trade in hides and buffalo hides and deer skins with Natchitoches. And so you're talking about the fur trade, right? Very early on. But you see here that he comerciaba, he traded with the indios bárbaros. And it's bizarre that they would use the term bárbaros because that means unacculturated, wild savages, if you will. But these were friendly Indians. They weren't, what basically is saying that maybe acknowledging was that they weren't Christianized Indians because the Caddos had largely refused to convert to Catholicism and settle in the missions of East Texas. But you have here the Tejas right there. San Pedro, Nazones, y Vidae. And Vidae weren't necessarily part of the Hassanite Confederacy. They were further to the south along the lower Trinity River, more of a coastal peoples, Atacapa related. And then you see also other items that ended up being traded, and it's kind of off the screen here, but the word trafiques that is used. And it says here, the word trafiques, and that is a term that I ended up putting in the glossary because I thought it was very significant, and it generally means to trade, to traffic. It could also mean to roam, to travel. And it's used as both an adjective and a noun, so that it also appears, and we'll see it later, as a noun. And it also shows the names of the Adeseños who were there. And so here we have that one descendant's ancestor, Domingo del Rio. You have Cristobal del Rio, Joaquin del Rio, Bartolomé de Sierra, and all of these folks. Juan Antonio Cargador, he's basically the muleteer for the governor. And that would be Juan Antonio Maldonado that I talk about. And he would go a lot of times between Los Arias and Natchitoches and engage in a lot of this trade on behalf of the governor. And on the next slide, we have some more trade. And we can see that the Indians and the Spanish trading in horses, maize, hides. The governor would oftentimes use the mission ranches, like Mission Nacogdoches, and store goods there. It was a good place to store not only goods, but to have the horses, the cattle. And a lot of times when it came to the issue of supplies for the troops that would be lacking is because that was filtering into this trade with the Indians. And that would present troubles in itself. But you also have then the document here in part of the investigation of Barrios and Huaraguin showing that, for example, here's another Chirinos, Domingo Chirinos, and he was a good one. He was a good Chirino, a good soldier. He had a brother named Andres who kept getting into trouble. His brother Andres would have probably been killed by Antonio Guilibarbo had it not been for Domingo, because Andres Chirino ended up fooling around with Antonio Guilibarbo's wife. And Ibarbo wanted him banished. Don't send him to Cuba. Heck, send him to Africa. And so you have Domingo Chirino and other of these soldiers from Los Arias being sent down to Saltillo. They're going to New Orleans. There was even one document showing they were going all the way to Mexico City. I'm like, are you kidding me? And, they were taking saddles and they're trading them for other goods. And there's a book by a historian of colonial Mexico, Andrew Knopf, who wrote a book called Black Market Capital about the Baratillos in the Baratillo marketplace in Mexico City, and talks about how this was the marketplace for the poor. And it's like thinking, there was a lot of secondhand goods that would show up there. And I just thought, my goodness, that you have this connection all the way from Mexico City along the Camino Real to, say, French Natchitoches, if you will. So there's a lot of movement going on in this area. And here's the word traficar. So they not only went to Saltillo, but then they'd end up going over, se llevaba todo lo que llevaba, the goods that they trafficked right here, trafique, used as a noun. and taking these goods to Natchitoches. Los demás, the rest, they went to traficar, used as a verb to go trade. And of course, we know the connotations of that word traffic in the present day, such that when we think about the issue of smuggling at the border today and the problems that we have in the border, this has got a really deep history right here in Texas, that it's just not the present Texas-Mexico border. It's a different border in a different century. And so then what I did was I mapped the movements of the soldiers from Los Adayas, and that's what appears in my book. You can see here the French post of Natchitoches on the lower Red River, which joins up with the Mississippi. And Los Adayas is just 15 miles to the west here of Natchitoches. And you have the soldiers oftentimes being sent to, especially to San Antonio. One ends up in San Saba later on, when the Spanish try to punish the Comanches for destroying Mission San Saba, but the Spanish just can't defeat the Comanches. One soldier named from Los Adayas, Antonio Treviño, is captured by the Comanches in mid-1760s. He was out with 3 other people. They had been hunting buffalo, as a matter of fact. And so he ended up being captured, and then when he was taken to the Taovaya fort on the Red River, which is the present border between Texas and Oklahoma. And then they realized this guy came from Los Adayas. They were like, oh, they come from a different tribe. They're not coming from San Antonio. And that the indigenous peoples were making distinctions amongst themselves of these different Spanish settlements, that the one in Los Adayas, oh, they're over there with the French. And so then he gets returned through the intercession of one of the Franciscan priests from Mission Nacoroches, Father Calahora. And so you have then this constant movement. And a lot of times they're even moving goods for the governor, or they're also engaged in smuggling themselves. As a matter of fact, there was a priest, Father Sedano from Mission La Bahia, who was caught coming back from Louisiana in the early 1760s. And he was stopped by Domingo Chirino and a few other soldiers from Los Adayas for smuggling. And apparently he had a lot of tobacco on him. And he claimed he had permission from the governor of Louisiana at that time, when you had the transfer from Louisiana from France to Spain, but he wasn't believed. And when he was asked about the tobacco, he said that the Indians of the Mission La Bahia, they like the French tobacco. And he literally says, because it was the best stuff. And it's like it was the 18th century version of modern marijuana, because the Spanish at the time had a monopoly of trade, the mercantile system, which they wanted to control everything. And so then you had the monopoly on the trade in horses and cattle and tobacco and everything. And so essentially then, you think about troops on the border, and you're supposed to prevent the movement of these people, deserters, smugglers, fugitive slaves coming from Louisiana to Texas. But at the same time, you have many of those soldiers being deployed to other parts of Spanish Texas. And then here's another example showing the gifts of, in this case, pólvora, powder, gunpowder, to the Indians. And this was gunpowder essentially for the officers and the soldiers, but also that were regalaron, or gifted to the Indios Tecohuacanas, which would be I believe it's the Tawacanis. And then you have the Iscansi, and then look at that, the Tejas, Vidai, even the Adayas Indians, the very name of the Spanish fort. And the Adayas Indians themselves were in between East Texas and French Natchitoches, and they were kind of semi-autonomous of the Hasinai Confederacy and the Natchitoches Confederacy, but they were familiar with the Caddoan language. They were respected for their shamans. So apparently other indigenous nations that turned to the Adayas because they were really good in terms of their medicine. But it's interesting that the Spanish records also show that Caddo Indians approached the Franciscans to receive baptism in Articuromotis. Whenever they were at or near death, they'd get baptized, but then they wouldn't stay in the missions. If they recovered, they went back to where they came in their settlements. And so it was almost like the Caddos were really just basically playing off the Spanish against the French, but also just trying to make the best of the situation. And what you essentially see are relationships between the Spanish and the Indians that are different in East Texas than you had in San Antonio and La Bahia. And a big reason for that is because of that French presence. One of the Franciscan missionaries in the late 1720s, early 1730s, petitioned the viceroy for permission to use the military, to use military force and gather the Caddos into the missions. But the viceroy denied that because of the fear that if you use Spanish military force to gather the missions into the Indians into the missions, that it would spark a rebellion of the Caddos and the French. And so it didn't mean that there wasn't interaction between the Caddos and the Spanish or the Franciscans. They were, and the Franciscans went beyond the missions. And so they were out there in the monte, or they were out there in the environment engaged with the Indians. And they were oftentimes in league with the governors in terms of their trade. They gave mass to the settlers at Los Adayas. They also went to French Natchitoches and gave the sacraments to the settlers in Natchitoches, because a lot of times there wouldn't be a Jesuit priest present. And so at the same time, the Franciscans are engaged in selling of partidas or certificates and engaging in business in Natchitoches. And you have these very intricate relationships of trade and kinship and worship. And that's one of the themes that I talk about in my book. But just the fact that to see the name Tejas right there, and spelled different ways too, so either with a J or an X. And so then we come to the next slide, and let's see if I can get this to turn here. You can get an aerial image from the Urrutia map in 1767. You can see the outlines of the fort there, the governor's house, a French trader's house that was supposed to be legal trade, better to keep an eye on, a legally, someone who has a licencia, a license, or more specifically pasaporte, a passport to trade legally. And you also have the mission that is further to the south, but these little rectangular symbols here that represent individual residences for soldiers and with their families, so that they not only had soldiers living inside the fort in the barracks, but those with families living in the surrounding pine forest. And they were able to do that because of the relations that they had with the indigenous peoples. And so then the House of the Curandera, it's interesting, I'd seen terms referenced hechiceros, or like shamans, sorcerers that the Spanish would use to describe the native religious leaders. But curandera, I didn't see that in the document for Los Adayas, but I had seen it in San Antonio, in which curanderas were called in to testify a lot of times in cases when you had, say, abuse, whether it was a spouse or a slave, and a curandera would become called in to check to see if whether the harm that was done, the bodily harm, was actually true or not. And so I thought that was pretty interesting that they actually have a house of a curandera. And, of course, that persists to the present day, especially here in San Antonio. But when you go there to the actual site, they have the outline of the fort that you saw in that aerial image. And then they have off to the side there, to the north west side here, a Spanish walk trail. You can't really see this, but it had a red sticker. It wasn't yellow that says caution. This was red and said danger. And I'm going, well, should I really walk this trail? I mean, I was by myself. I had a pocket knife, but I don't know if I should walk it. And then you walk in, and there's like a sign that says this is where one of the houses would have been of one of the soldier settlers. This is an irrigation ditch. There was an arroyo that they'd use for spring water to be able to have water. And then at the end of the trail, you have where the mission would have been, at the top of a hill. And so then it's really just quite beautiful just walking through there. It's almost like you're going back in a time machine, like something out of a Michael Crichton novel, except in timeline. He's going back to like 14th century medieval France, and I'd probably prefer this a lot better. But in the next slide then, let's see if I can get it to go. This carries forward. So this is beyond, well, my epilogue talks about the Adeseños after the abandonment. But it's interesting that in terms of trade, this is a document from the Bear Archives, 1803, so the same year as the Louisiana Purchase, and you see Barr and Davenport's invoice of goods. These were Americans who were allowed by the Spanish to establish a legal shop to trade with the Indians, because as it would happen, the Spanish were going to be in competition with the United States for the allegiance of the Indians, and the best way of doing that was through trade. And so it's interesting here that you have this invoice, and look at the goods. You have wheat, lead, ammo, gunpowder, salt, tobacco, liquor, sugar, coffee, paper. Paper was scarce on the frontier, and so you didn't have a lot of the royal stamp on documents, so that was also an issue that could lead into smuggling. But rice. And up at the top, it mentions that you have the arrieros, or the muleteers, Ruiz and Seguin. And these are prominent Tejanos that we know of in San Antonio, and it's fascinating to look at Natchitoches, Louisiana, and Los Adayas to see that there were these deep ties in East Texas and northwestern Louisiana that become very, very important later on in the early 19th century when it came to Mexican independence from Spain, and then later Texas independence from Mexico, and the ties between Tejanos and Natchitoches. And so then, let me go back. If I can go back to that previous slide, this one right here, this is the border on the left-hand side. Archaeologists, the Arroyo Hondo, which the Spanish believed was the border. And I was asked once at a conference many years ago about, is it really a border? And I said, well, it's not much of a border. It looks like just any creek. But to the Spanish and French officials, this mattered, because when it came to smugglers, deserters, fugitive slaves, where that border was mattered. And for example, I talk about in the book, fugitive slaves, you had African slaves, of French slaveholders, who crossed the border and sought asylum in the Spanish missions. And so the governor had to negotiate, do we return these or not? And you had one governor, Martos and Navarrete, arguing with LeBlanc or McCarty at Natchitoches, talking about how the French, treating their slaves badly, and then the French commandant turning around and telling the governor, well, don't talk to us about slavery, because what about all these Indian slaves that you have? And technically the Spanish weren't supposed to have them. And you have then this border that begins to matter in the 1730s, 40s. It matters again later on after the Louisiana Purchase. That's why we ended up with what was called the Neutral Ground Agreement that prevented war between the United States and Spain. And in the global picture, at least hemispheric, in the 1730s, 1740s, Spain, in its empire in the Americas are trying to enforce prosecution against contraband trade, because it's not just East Texas, Louisiana, but it's Curacao, the Dutch colony in northern South America off the coast of Venezuela. Lots of smuggling going on. Also, lots of smuggling going on in many other ports throughout the Spanish America. And Spain ended up trying to reform under the Bourbon reforms in the later 18th century its economy and its military, but they weren't willing to allow for what appears in the documents is comercio libre, free trade. They were very concerned about the comercio ilícito, illicit trade, or what we know as smuggling. And so the border then did matter. And this kind of came and went as time moved forward. So I'll go ahead and stop there with the time that I have left. Thank you very much. I think there is time for... Okay.
There is about 15.
Okay. Yes, Bruce.
I do have a comment. You mentioned the Ramones, and Catherine Nelson Hall introduced me to the Ramones as a descendant of them, and we got out a book that was done in the 1930s of the Ramon Brothers, and we got to tracing trips across the routes that Saint Denis set. And what you mentioned is incredibly important about movement that people completely overlook when they're working. We figure in about a 12 to 14 month period, these guys rode on horseback over 2,000 miles from Querétaro to Los Adas. It's just crazy.
Yeah, I mean, that is just something that I wish that there could be like a diary that in the 18th century. There's a few that appear later on after Los Adas, but to follow those movements would be really wonderful. There is the prosecution against Blancpain, who was a French trader in the 1750s from New Orleans, who the Spanish prosecute, and and he documents his movement along the coastal area to the south. In southwestern Louisiana into where he's trying to get is the lower Trinity River, and he of course has slaves on his among him. But Santani really does get also overlooked because of the fact that so much attention is on LaSalle. I mean, he was a great explorer, but not so much in terms of colonization. And Santani was able to establish trade with New Spain through the north because Spain did not allow legal trade with France through the port of Veracruz. And so from Louisiana, the French were able to cut a back door into northern New Spain to get to the silver mining communities, the silver trade. And so those trails that they would have traveled, I mean, and Bruce, I had to also make sure that I mentioned in there that a lot of these would have been indigenous trails too, so that, it's not just that it appeared out of nowhere, but, so yeah.
Both the Saint Denis trails are drawn on the Delisle map of 1718, which does not show New Orleans or San Antonio because it was published before.
Yeah. San Antonio, May of 1718, and New Orleans, right before New Orleans, also 1718. It's amazing that, when we celebrated our tricentennial, New Orleans was also celebrating theirs. But forgotten is, you have Natchitoches established a few years before that. And, but anyway, you have very interesting. Yeah, so it was abandoned by the summer of 1773, after there was another inspection by the Spanish Marquez de Rubi in 1767, 1768. He commented about how horrible the place was in terms of what it was supposed to do. It's actually in the record, there was like muchas fiestas. There were too much like partying going on and soldiers shooting balas, and it's like, no, we need those, don't waste your ammo, kind of thing. The calidad of the soldiers, there was a complaint too that he had in terms that these weren't superior Spaniards, but these were mulattoes and mixed caste people too. There were a number of the soldiers who were Tlaxcalans from Coahuila. They were Tlaxcalan Indian, the Indians that the Spanish used to help them conquer the Aztecs, that they helped to colonize in the north as model of good Indians. I mean, it's very fascinating in terms of identity. But the lack of conversion of the Catos and the missions, so there were many reasons to abandon it. And also because with the French and Indian War, you had Spain transferring France transferring Louisiana to Spain, and on the eve of the treaty that ended, the first Treaty of Paris of 1763. And so the border, so basically Louisiana became part of New Spain, and the border would have been the Mississippi. And so it was seen that in cost-cutting moves under the Bourbon reforms to suppress Los Udayas and the East Texas missions, bring those people back to San Antonio, shore up San Antonio, which was, really having a tough time in the 1770s. And the king ordered them abandon it in 1772. And ironically, Lieutenant Joseph Gonzalez, who oftentimes was left in charge of Los Udayas because the governors would spend more time in San Antonio than in Los Udayas, he was the one who had to order them out of their homes and force them to march to San Antonio. But he died on the way over, and about 10 children died. Antonio Guilibarbo's mother became ill, and he left her at the Rancho Lobanillo near in between Nacogdoches and San Agustin. So there was a lot of resentment on the part of those settlers, and over half of them, under Antonio Guilibarbo, petitioned the viceroy, and they're allowed to go back. They wanted to go all the way back to like practically Natchitoches, but they were only allowed to go as far as the lower Trinity River, where they established Bucareli for about 5 years until 1779. Because of disease, flooding, drought, attacks from Comanches, they decide to move further east, and they go to the former site of Nacogdoches, the mission Nacogdoches, and they established the Pueblo de Nacogdoches. And so, meanwhile, the others that remained in San Antonio, they petitioned for land, and eventually, about 1793, they get lands from the secularized Mission San Antonio de Valero, and they established the Barrio de Valero, or like the neighborhood of Valero, because San Antonio had like 5 barrios, different neighborhoods. And so, there is, I think because of the fact that it was abandoned, and you don't think of it having been a permanent settlement, it's difficult because, well, it's no longer there. But the archaeologists uncovered the site, and part of what they did was they went to oral history, and they interviewed descendants of like European immigrants who lived in that area, and they recall, like, when they were kids during World War II, they remember the U.S. military practicing military maneuvers in that area because they were getting ready for Europe. Or old-timers reminiscing about being young and in love and running into the woods, and then it's like, well, they were just, it was kind of like a nostalgia for that. And eventually they ended up, the daughters of the colonists of Louisiana, or daughters of the American Revolution, donated land. That's where the site for that site, and so now it's debated whether they're going to do above ground restoration. I think was there a comment or question over there? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And Santani, I mean, for me, I think it was Santani that historian Don Chipman said in his book Spanish Texas would change the course of Texas history. I wrote another article for our Hispanic Heritage of Texas series, Arte Público Press in Houston, and I said that if Santani was the godfather of the region there in East Texas, northwestern Louisiana, I said that his wife, Manuela Sanchez Navarro, who was the daughter of the Commandant Ramon there at San Juan Bautista on the Rio Grande, which is near present-day Eagle Pass, she must be the godmother. And one of my colleagues, historian Amy Porter, said, make sure you talk about the women. And so it was like trying to bring in gender analysis where it's like, oh my God, this is incredible. Because then you have these women who are like, you know, these pioneers. Manuela Sanchez Navarro, and then Joseph Gonzalez, his wife, Gertrudis de la Cerda. In other words, women that are also working in the background in terms of forging these ties between those communities that are out there. And it's tough to get at the issue of women from the archives because you don't see them mentioned like in a lot of these documents, but they do appear. Well, and it's interesting too that there is also the famous Angelina, the Caddo Indian woman who was the guide, and Manuela Sanchez Navarro. I don't know. There's maybe a few minutes. Okay, she and Santani had 2 children at San Juan Bautista before she went with him back to Natchitoches. When Santani went back to Natchitoches, and they had I think 3 more children, and one of the they had. Angelina, who was Caddo Indian woman, was one of his guides. And so, I mean, he had already brokered relations with the Caddo Indians. And so for Saint-Denis to be able to establish those trade ties, the French, I mean, they had this argument that, well, you know what, the border western boundary of Louisiana did extend to the Rio Grande. Remember Saint-Denis and what he did at the fort of San Juan Bautista? The problem was the Spanish officials in Mexico City were like, this is a lot of smuggling going on up there. And there was even the reference to the Ramones as like the Ramonistas, like as if they were their own, you know, modern day cartel, if you will. And the French and the Spanish did try. I saw the term cartel appear in some French documents in the 1750s where they're trying to establish some kind of cartel, a trade agreement. Not to be confused with just, you know, when we think of cartels today, but, you know, something that would be legal in terms of trade. And it's just interesting that even though the Spanish and the French were Bourbon cousins under the same Bourbon monarchy, you know, the Spanish officials in Texas still had a lot of mistrust towards Louisiana. And I think that there was a lot of mistrust towards the people from Los Adayas who came into San Antonio after the fort was abandoned. Go ahead.
One more point. There is one county in Texas that is named after a woman.
Angelina. Yeah. And, well, much to be said in terms of gender analysis here, and I'd rather defer that to some colleagues who really talk about the importance of women in this region. But yeah, it's huge. I mean, Saint-Denis dies in 1744. His wife, Manuela Sanchez Navarro de Saint-Denis, lives another 20 years, and she's like the in Spanish you'd say the mero for a guy, you know, but she was like, I don't know, mera. I mean, she was like, you know, most powerful person there, if you will, in Natchitoches. And so yeah, I think that's 2 minutes. Okay. Oh, one more question.
The outline of the mission, actual mission, has been plotted.
Good question. I'd have to ask the archaeologist. I'll probably see George Avery this fall. There's a panel for the East Texas Historical Association meeting in October, and there's some really, let's just say, history enthusiasts who are really interested in locating the exact spot of Bucareli and you know, other Spanish sites there, including Tejas. because they are archaeologists, anthropologists, and they're really studying those trails. That's a good question too. Since that's a total recreation and not completely accurate representation, I mean, I would be careful with that. But it could be very much still within the vicinity in terms of where the Camino Real runs through, along State Highway 21. Yeah. All right. Thank you. We're out of time. Thank you very much.